Hello, everyone. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I always just really appreciate all of your time and joining me to learn a little bit more about bees, talk about what's going on in our bees right now, and what we should all be doing to take care of our bees in whatever season we find ourselves in. So, thank you for joining us. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Blake, and I'm one of the owners of the Bee Supply. And we have a really special guest later tonight named Marcus Hill, and I'll introduce him in a little more detail later in the evening. He's got a great presentation for us that's so applicable to this time of year. But Marcus is the head of our beekeeping operations for Desert Creek. And so some of you may not know, but we actually have 6 different companies in the beekeeping world. We have the Bee Supply that sells supplies and bees to small scale beekeepers. And we have commercial bee supply that does the same thing, but for commercial beekeepers. And then, of course, we have Desert Creek, our own commercial beekeeping operation. We have a pollination company, a company that raises and sells bulk bees, and then a honey packing company where we package and sell honey. And so 6 different companies, and Marcus is over all the beekeeping companies. And so super smart guy. You're going to love meeting him later tonight. And I do plan, I think I mentioned this last webinar, but I do plan this winter when there's not as much to talk about in the bee world because our bees are in hibernation. I want to give you guys a little more of an overview of my story and how I got started and how I started these businesses, and then what all these companies do and how they interact, and kind of a year in the life of a commercial beekeeper and a year in the life in this industry. So I look forward to doing that a little bit later in the season. But for tonight, we got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to jump right in. So if you do still need bees, we do have bees. We are in our last month of selling bees, so we're almost done selling bees for the season. So if you need any hives, this is your last chance to get some bees before we wrap it up for the year. So we also have pollen patties in stock. So if you are experiencing a summer dearth, a lot of the country is, then we have our global pollen patties, which I think are the best pollen patties on the market. That's what I use for feeding all of our thousands of beehives. It's what we are using constantly this time of year. And so we'll talk about when to use those and when not to use those, because as we always talk about, we're not just here to sell you a product, we're here to help keep your bees alive and keep your bees healthy. And so there is a time when it's appropriate to feed pollen patties, and then there's a time when it's not as beneficial. And so we'll kind of talk about when to use it and when not to use it later tonight. And then similarly, we'll talk about trickle feeding, and we've got Stan's soft sugar bricks that are fantastic for trickle feeding. If you've got a hive that has almost enough food and you don't want to give it gallons of syrup, these sugar bricks are a great alternative to give them a small amount of food over a long period of time, and that can help stimulate brood rearing. So these are in stock now, and we are making some cool changes to them soon. We're adding some new ingredients, and you'll see that in an email probably here in the next couple of weeks of how we're changing and improving these sugar bricks to be even better for the bees. Last thing I want to throw out there before we dive in is we've talked a lot about our bee warranty in the spring. So this was our first year offering a bee warranty where you can purchase this warranty for any bees that you've bought from us. And if your bees die, then we'll give you a free beehive next spring. If your bees don't die and you don't use the warranty, then we'll give you a 50% refund on that warranty. So it's hard to lose. Since most of us lose a lot of beehives every year, it makes a lot of financial sense to sign up for a warranty and get a free beehive next year if something happens to yours, or again, that 50% refund if you don't use it. Now, we stopped selling this warranty back in the spring. but we decided for about a week to open this back up for 1 week just to honestly see how it goes. And so we stopped selling it back in spring. We're opening it back up for 1 week. And so if you have bought bees from TBS in 2024, then you can go and purchase this warranty for any hives that you bought from us at any point in 2024, just in the next week. So, and then you can, of course, go to our website, follow that QR code, or go to our website and read all the terms and all the details of that warranty. So, Sherry, tell us what is going on in our pretty historic edition
Ooh,
of
it
our
is.
of our magazine this month.
It is. I don't know if people can see me because you're spot on. There we are. Oh,
There we go. I
you
switched it.
guys have-
Yeah.
That is a historic 50. I know, right? I hope everybody else finds the joy in that. Certainly was a mind-numbing moment for me to put in 50 on that one. But get ready, I'm doing 51, 51 here right now. All right, so it's August, y'all. We turned August. Can you believe it? So Blake has listed here a couple of the key articles that are listed that are promoted in this issue, and I'm going to talk about that first one, so I'm going to skip across it. But one that I think is super great that Blake did. It's hot and my bees are being mean. No, we've never had that happen before, have we? Could my bees be starving? That almost ties in with the other. Honey or pollen bound, that's a big deal. And I think that how we react to that pretty much takes us in through the fall. So read that article as well. Understanding and managing Varroa mites, visual clues and strategies. I think you'll like that one because we are in that season, whether we want to admit it or not, we are. And last, before I switch to my spotlight, is I made y'all a video on how to take off and reinstall a veil. Did it right here sitting at my desk. I did it just for you. So I'm just chuckling because it took me like 14 tries to get it right, but I did. So if you need assistance in that, I have a little short write-up about how to wash your suit, and I did that little video. If you want just a good chuckle, you might want to go to that. All right, I'm ready for my spotlight. And so this is something I've talked about before. And anybody that knows me know that this is my wheelhouse. I love marketing. Number one, when you got a good product like your own personal honey, how can you not want to market that the best possible way you can? I wrote this article to pretty much hit all of the spots where that you need in order to make your honey the best seller out of your area, because we really want that, right? We want to stand out above the rest. So a few of the items that I hit upon, and I promise I only lightly hit upon laws and regulations. There's 5 jurisdictions, but I only lightly hit across it. So that way there's links to some of them, and I won't bore you with that now. And I kept it very minimal. Containers and bottles. Let cost and functionality be your guide. That ought to just summarize what I talk about in that paragraph. Look that up because it really is, it's almost, you need to make that decision before you do your labels. And that segues to the basic labeling. There's tons of options. I do list a few with some costs in there and gave you some, I think, pretty good advice on where you should start to look and where that might lead you to. Quantity definitely matters on that. If you want to get a good price, you're going to want to buy a lot of them. But I also have some cautions in there for you. Attributes to consider on those labels, I've got that listed out. Building a great label, because so many of us, we might not have the ability to just pop that out of our head. I make a couple of suggestions, and regardless of how you feel about artificial intelligence, AI, you can go in and get some really nice logos generated that are special just to you. Why not take advantage of that? Put in a couple of keywords and have your own label created, or your own verbiage and logo created for you right there, and most of the time for free, right? marketing your honey, you've got to hit your own market. You've got to know what's around you, what other beekeepers are in your area, where you can sell. I kind of go off into detail about that. And then I end it with pricing your honey. And you really and truly have to focus on the target buyer. So I hope you look at it. I hope you enjoy it. It's on page 8. That's all I got.
Awesome, Sherry. And thank you so much. I mean, 50, I almost said episodes, 50 editions is quite a feat. So thank you for, as always, doing such an incredible job of with the magazine. I did want to call out really quickly before I forget. Sherry and myself, and then Brian, who is our marketing manager, were chatting last month that we really feel like it's time to refresh our monthly buzz webinar. We've been, when we started doing this really during COVID several years ago, there weren't, almost nobody was doing this kind of thing, like an hour and a half, kind of in the bee yard and then class and then a speaker, kind of this almost virtual bee meeting. No one was really doing that at the time, and so it's evolved somewhat since then. But we really want to evolve it again over the next couple of months into a new and updated format with new and updated activities and interactions. And so when you exit out of the webinar tonight, there's going to be a survey that just is going to ask you a few questions. So when you X out tonight, it'll automatically pop up. And if you don't mind, leave some thoughts and feedback. It's going to ask several, 2 or 3 questions and ask for your suggestions. So if you don't mind filling that out, that would be great, because we're kind of in the middle of rebuilding the monthly webinar as we know it. So with that, let's jump out in the bee yard. Let's see what the bees are up to. And then we will come back and have a little bit more classroom time. So here we go out into the bee yard.
Hey friends, it is August, and that means we're in the dog days of summer. So pretty much anywhere you go in the country, it's pretty hot. Our bees are done completely making honey, or they're really close to being done, and our full attention shifts to taking care of our bees over the summer, preparing them for winter. As hard as that is to believe when it's so hot outside and dry in many areas, yes, we have to start thinking about winter preparation. So we were doing things like treating for mites. We're making sure our mite treatments worked if we've already treated for mites. We're feeding bees if they have less than 30 or 40 pounds of honey stores. We're making sure they don't need a new queen. We're making sure we're thinking about winter, which is only a couple months away or less, depending on where you are in the country. And so we've got to make sure, ideally, 4 to 6 weeks before daytime temperatures are in the mid-50s consistently, we want to make sure our hives are completely ready for winter. So in some areas, that's coming really fast. In others, you still have a few months. But regardless, your bees need to be completely ready for winter. So plenty of food stores, mite treatments done, mites completely under control, robust population, healthy queen. All that needs to occur 4 to 6 weeks before daytime temperatures are consistently in the 50s. So we've got a lot of work to do. We're going to check on some bees and make sure that we've got them ready to go through the summer successfully, and we're setting them up properly for winter. So let's jump on in. Today, let's talk a little bit about sun versus shade. It's a huge question if you're new to beekeeping. Should I put my bees in the full sunlight, in the full shade, somewhere in between? And the answer is, it depends. In general, the general rule of thumb is that bees do best in the full sunlight. I know that seems a little counterintuitive, especially if you're in a southern climate, because it gets so hot. Here I am in August, and you've got all these beehives behind me, and as you can see, a lot of them are in the full sun. I have some in the back corner behind me that are in the partial shade. In the summer months, I do like it if my hives can get some partial shade during the heat of the day. It just means they have to work a little bit less to keep the hive cool. But a strong hive can keep a hive cool even in the hot summers. Now, the exception is during the summer months, I always want my bees to be at least 2 boxes. That gives them more space to keep the hive cooler rather than the sun beating down directly on the lid of a single-story hive. Now, you can see a lot of these hives are Apiary hives, or they're the insulated hives. Those tend to do fine even as single-story hives in the summer. But if it's an uninsulated box, you want to make sure there's at least 2 on a hive if they're in the sunlight. If they're not in the sun, then they can get by with a standard wooden box with just 1 box, but they need to be pretty much in the full shade. 2 boxes in a wood hive, they're going to over summer just fine in the full sunlight. Now, in the spring months, I prefer them to be in full sun. Same with the fall and winter. Full sun is better. So summertime in a hot climate is the only exception where they do a little better if they are in partial shade in the afternoons. Other than that, year-round full sun is preferable. Now, again, you're not going to kill a hive in the full sunlight in the summer unless it's a single-story hive in a wooden box and it's a weak hive. Those tend to be the ones that struggle the most in full sunlight through the summer. Otherwise, they tend to do pretty well. I'm going to show you though what we see. I'm going to pick up the camera and show you a little bit of the difference between a hive in the full sun versus in the shade. So we've got this hive right here, and you can see they are not fanning. I mean, it is the heat of the day. It's about 100 degrees outside, and there is no fanning going on. I mean, they aren't even trying to cool the hive because they're in the shade. Versus if I go over to a hive in the full sun, even though it's an mostly insulated hive, on this one the top 2 boxes are wooden and the bottom's insulated, but you can see there's still a lot of fanning going on. I mean, those bees are fanning really hard to keep the hive cool. So they'll both survive perfectly fine, but this hive is just going to work a little bit harder to keep the hive cool. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if they're in that partial shade in the afternoon, they're just going to have to work a little bit less. But if you have to choose one or the other, I recommend going with the full sunlight over full shade. Hives in full shade can develop different brood diseases. Small hive beetles like the shade better. They stay a little cooler, especially in the fall and winter months. They don't warm up as quickly. So if you have to pick one, pick the full sun. Otherwise, if you have an option, partial shade in the afternoon is okay. When I'm checking hives after I've harvested honey, going through summer, I'm really looking for just a couple of main things. I'm looking for the bee population, because that's a clue as to the health of the hive. I'm checking on the queen and how well she's laying and what her brood pattern looks like. And then the big thing I'm looking at is making sure I have a mite treatment on the hive, or I've treated for mites and that's working. And then finally, I'm looking at food stores. The big 2 are really food stores and making sure mites are under control. I usually check bees in the summertime in the morning or in the evening, just because it is so hot outside. And that's for my own sake, but then also for the bees. You know, I don't really want to disturb them when they're trying to fan hard and keep the hive cool. So with this hive in particular, you know, the first thing I always do when I open up a hive is I look down between the frames. They've got about, 7 to 8 frames full of bees in this hive. And I'm not going to go deep. I'm just going to open the hive and look at some of these frames on the edge to see, hey, do they have uncapped cells of nectar or syrup? How much pollen do they have? How much brood do they have? How's the bee population look compared to the last time? I am feeding these hives because we took most of the honey away. So I've got lots of frames that look like this, which is a great frame, capped honey up in the corners, and then uncapped honey or syrup there in the middle. So I want to see that. I want to see that they've got, about 30 pounds of excess honey. And then I'm going to just check on the brood and make sure that the brood looks okay, and I've got brood. So you can't see it in the video, but this frame has lots of eggs in it and larvae, so that's always great to see. And our goal over the summer is really just to help the bees maintain their strength. I don't really expect them to grow much because it's a winter dearth. It's a summer dearth, and they aren't going to be growing a whole lot. I've got eggs, I've got larvae. The brood pattern isn't great, but honestly, I don't expect it to be that great during the summer. I have my Apivar strips in the hive to treat for Varroa mites. And one thing I'm not seeing hardly any of is I'm really not seeing hardly any pollen. So when I look through this hive, you know, I always want to see a cumulative half frame of pollen. So if I were to add up all the frames of pollen throughout the whole hive, I want to see at least a half a frame. And I'm really seeing very, very little. Here, I'll show you what I'm seeing in most cases. So I've only seen a couple of frames that have a little bit of pollen on them. Let's see if I can get to where you can see it. So if you look in the dead center of that frame, and I don't think you're going to be able to see it really well, I see a few cells full of pollen. If you're ever in doubt as to whether something is capped honey or pollen, let me grab my hive tool. Just take your hive tool and dig in a little bit and see if it's liquid or if it's solid. If it's solid, then it's going to be pollen. So like this cell right here, I can kind of tunnel in and look, I've got this, I've got this pollen on my hive tool here. If it's liquid, so here's some capped cells, it's liquid underneath, well, that's just honey. So you can dig in a little bit if you're unclear on what's what. But I'm really seeing almost no pollen, and that means that I'm probably going to go ahead and give this hive a pollen patty. Again, not because I'm trying to get them to grow like crazy, but I'm really wanting them to at least maintain their bee population so that they've got plenty of bees going into winter so that they can properly overwinter. So I'm just going to do a really quick check in the bottom box here. I've got a pretty decent bee population, making sure I'm not missing any big frames of brood or anything down below, or any frames full of pollen. And again, I've got some decent brood, but almost no pollen in the bottom box either. And I really only have 4 or 5 frames of honey in this hive. So I'm going to feed this hive a couple gallons of syrup. I'll give them about half a gallon or so per week for the next 4 weeks or so. And then I'm going to give them probably 1 pollen patty every 7 to 10 days. And they should be good to go throughout the summer. How do you tell when your honey flow is over? You know, it can be frustrating because every year is a little bit different. You know, flowers and bees don't follow the books and the calendars. You know, every year the honey flow may end 2 weeks early or go 2 weeks later. So how do you know that your honey flow is over and you can harvest your honey? There's really a couple main ways to do that. You can look at what's going on inside your hive, and you can look at what's going on outside your hive. If all your flowers have pretty much dried up and died, your honey flow is probably over. This is where it's helpful to get to know your local forage and understand what flowers are your main honey producers. When those main flowers start to die off, you know your honey flow is coming to an end. But the biggest clues also occur inside your hive. One thing that I often do when it's coming near towards the end of the honey flow, or if I'm wondering if the honey flow has even started, it works both ways, I will often go out to a hive, open it up, and I'll find a frame of honey, or a frame with lots of honey on it, which is not the case in this box. And I'll set that frame of honey to the side for about 20 or 30 minutes. And if there's no honey flow, then after 20 minutes or so, bees are going to start robbing that frame. And that's a clue to me that, oh, the honey flow either hasn't started yet or it's over. So here's a frame with a good amount of honey on it. Ideally, you want uncapped honey, but I'm going to shake the bees off of it. And I'm just going to set this frame to the side in the partial shade. If it's in the middle of summer, the sun can actually melt that honey. So I want it in the partial shade or melt the wax. And I'm just going to leave it there for 20 minutes, do my other inspections. And if I see robber bees all over that frame, it's a good sign the honey flow has ended. And I'm going to shake those robber bees off and quickly put it back into the hive. The other thing you can do is you can do a shake test. So when you're going through your honey supers, pretend that this is a honey super, not a brood box. You can get your frames that are full of honey, uncapped honey, and you can shake them. You can gently shake the bees off, and then you hold the frame horizontally and you shake it. And you can see if any nectar rains out of those frames. If a lot of nectar is raining out of your frame, your honey isn't cured yet and it's not ready to harvest. But if you're shaking and nothing comes out, it's pretty much cured and it's ready to harvest. If your bees are actively eating the honey, so instead of frames full of open nectar, the bees are uncapping the cells and eating the honey, that's a sign it's over. So you can see on this frame, all of these cells are full of uncapped honey. And so that's a good indicator that they're still bringing a little bit in. Once they start uncapping this capped honey and eating it, that's when you really know that, hey, the flow's over. They've switched from capping and storing honey to uncapping and eating the honey. So that's a great indicator too that the honey flow is over and you're ready to harvest. So check on what's going on inside your hive, check on what's going on outside the hive, and that's combined will tell you whether or not the flow is over. Let's talk a little bit about water sources. If you're in an area where it's hot and it's dry, your bees need water throughout the summer. Now they don't drink water and they don't need the moisture for themselves, but they use it to keep the hive cool. And so they need to fly to a water source, store the water in their stomach, fly back to the hive, and then they'll spit out the water and fan their wings to help evaporatively cool the hive. Now, this is pretty important, and especially if your hives are in the sunlight instead of in the shade, which is fine. You know, hives should be in the full sun rather than in full shade. Afternoon shade is fine in the summertime. But regardless, the bees do need a water source, and a strong hive can drink 1 to 2 quarts of water a day to keep the hive cool. So if there's not a natural pond or a creek or a lake within a half to 1 mile of your hives, it's a good idea to provide that. And if you're in an urban environment, it's good to provide a water source so that your bees aren't bothering your neighbor's swimming pool. So a water source can be anything. It can be any container of water. The key things to remember is it should be in the shade. It doesn't have to be deep shade, but at least partial to full shade. Because if that water gets really hot, the bees aren't going to want to drink it. The water doesn't need to be clean. In fact, dirtier water is a little better sometimes. The bees don't like really clean water. And so don't worry about cleaning the container or keeping the moss out of it. The bees don't mind. And then the third most important thing is that there's something for the bees to land on so that they don't drown. That could be floating pieces of wood. It could be gravel. It can be anything. It can be, a lot of people get the noodles that you have in the swimming pool and slice those up and put a bunch into the water source. Anything that the bees can land on and get a drink of water. Some people put a little bit of chlorine in the water because bees actually like chlorine. It's one of the reasons they're attracted to swimming pools. But let's go take a look at some bees drinking out of a pond nearby. And then as I'm walking over there, I'll also show you a little bit of footage from a waterer that we have at one of our bee supply stores to water our bees at that bee yard. So this pond is about 100 yards from where our bee yard is here, and the bees just love it. I mean, of course, the water isn't clean, but there is water here year round. And I mean, any time of day, once it starts getting warm out here, you can come out and just see the bees. You know, they're all over the moss at the edge of the pond, drinking that water, bringing it back to the hives. And of course, this is absolutely perfect for the bees. And so if you have a pond like this, really within a half a mile or so, then you're going to be fine. The bees are going to fly to that, get water, no problem. But if you're, if you don't have anything, within a mile or so, then you want to provide that water source, or if you're in an urban area. And you know, it's certainly if you're in a drought and all the ponds start to dry up, which happens a lot in the south, then you want to provide that water source as well.
All right, folks, so there is our bee yard portion. Let me jump back over here to the classroom and keep this rolling. I did have some special helpers out in, not while I was filming this month, but a couple weeks before. We were checking bees in preparation for filming, and I had two helpers out there. These are my daughters that they're pretty good beekeepers already, and so they have their own bee suits and their own boots and gloves, and they love to come out and help in the bee yard. So they're always a blast. One of these days, I do need to get them into a webinar when I'm actually filming the videos out in the bee yard. That would be super adorable. So one of these days, I'll make that happen. So we usually look at the drought monitor. Here is the drought monitor 2024, August of 2024 compared to August of 2023. You know, we have a lot of areas, the central US, looking pretty good as far as very little drought. And then we have the, you know, the Northwest is got some mild to moderate drought going on. And then some of the East Coast has some drought going on. Not horrible in general, but it's helpful to be aware of what is going on drought-wise in your area so that you can know how much you should be feeding your bees. Usually the worse the drought is, the more you're going to need to be feeding that pollen substitute over the summer. So kind of what I'm seeing nationwide right now, I certainly saw this in the South, is honey flows are weird. You know, a lot of areas have gotten really dry, but then had a wet July. And so you've had some late honey flows in areas that usually the honey flow is very much over. And I've seen that really all over the country, where a lot of people have said, oh, usually my honey flow is done, but my bees are still bringing in nectar. So it's kind of sporadic and all over the place. It goes to the importance in that video out in the bee yard of being able to tell when your honey flow is done, not just relying on a date, because you can always have weird wet months and have a crazy late honey flow, or really hot dry months and it ends early. Most regions have a fair pollen flow, and you can always test how well your pollen flow is based on putting out dry pollen substitute. So we sell it, other companies sell it, but you can buy just a pound of dry pollen substitute and put that out. And if there's a really bad pollen dearth, the bees will forage on that dry powder. If there's a natural pollen flow, they usually won't touch that dry powder. Obviously, there's a big variance depending on what region you're in. But in general, what I'm seeing in summer hives is 6 to 8 frames of brood. Queens are, I shouldn't say shutting down, they are reducing their output in many areas. So we're kind of going into that summer dearth, or that honey flow slow down. And instead of seeing that like 10 to 12 frames of brood that I might have seen earlier in the spring, now I'm seeing more like 6 to 8 frames of brood on the average hive, and not as much brood rearing going on. I'm also seeing spottier brood. And so, like, especially this picture you can see on the left here, the brood is just a little more spotty. And that's pretty normal to see in the summer months as the bees start putting pollen and nectar in those brood frames, and the queen kind of starts laying around them. So that's pretty normal to see that, more of that summer brood. I did want to do a quick poll though, because I've been asking this same question every month for the last 2 months, and I want to ask it again just because I'm super curious. So this is the honey flow compared to last year. How was your honey crop? Is it worse than last year, the same as last year, better than last year, or you don't know because this is your very first year? And it's been interesting because and maybe next month I'll share the 3 months compared to each other. But the first month, I guess that would have been I think June was the first month I asked. Everyone was pretty optimistic in general and said, oh, it's going really good. And then in July it was like, it's not looking so good now, but still I think it was about 50-50. It's worse or the same as last year. This month, it looks like 31% of you say it's worse than last year. 15% of you say the same as last year. 28% say it's better than last year, and about 28% say you don't know this is your first year. So if we kind of rule out the first year folks, then kind of half and half. About half of you say worse than last year, about half of you say better than last year. So not a runaway success for most of us, but a pretty mixed bag, which honestly is pretty normal for beekeeping. One thing I have had a lot of questions about this year, though, is high moisture honey. A lot of regions got a lot of rain during the honey crop. Even areas that usually have really dry honey are experiencing wet honey this year for some reason. So I don't know exactly what's going on there, but a lot of beekeepers are saying, hey, I harvested my honey. It's really thin. It's kind of watery. It's like 19 to 20% moisture. And that honey can ferment. I mean, honey over about 19% moisture is at risk of fermenting. And you can test the moisture content by using a refractometer. And so you can buy kind of a cheaper handheld refractometer or a more expensive digital one, or better yet, find a friend that has one that they'll let you borrow, because even the cheap ones are like $75. But here are some things to keep in mind if you have high moisture honey. The first step is not harvesting until you're pretty sure it's cured. So that's where that shake test that I showed out in the bee yard is so important. If you hold that frame over the hive and shake it and nothing really comes out more than a couple drips, you shouldn't have a moisture problem. But if you're able to really shake a lot of drips out of that frame, probably not quite ready to harvest yet. If you do harvest it and it is high moisture, you can freeze it right away. That's not going to fix your moisture problem, but it'll prevent fermentation. Conversely, you can heat the honey. So if you heat the honey to about 120 degrees for 24 hours or so, that will kill the yeasts that cause the honey to ferment. It won't necessarily kill it permanently, but for several months, it'll kind of shut down that fermenting process. And even though it's high moisture, it shouldn't ferment after you've killed that yeast with the heat. You can intentionally granulate your honey. So you can take your honey, you can add about 10% previously granulated honey in with your liquid honey and mix it up, and that will granulate your honey really quickly. And that doesn't completely prevent fermentation, but it'll slow down the fermentation process as well. If you think you're going to use it all within a few months anyway, that can slow it down. The ideal thing is to remove that moisture. So if you do have high moisture honey and you harvested it, the ideal thing is to get rid of some of that moisture. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. So Sherry sent me this picture of what they've got going on in their house right now. They've got a cooler and they've got open buckets of honey, and they've got a dehumidifier in the cooler. Obviously that lid stays closed, and they just run this for a couple of weeks. And that little mini dehumidifier, you can get them off Amazon really cheap, just continually sucks moisture out of those open buckets of honey. It takes a minute, especially if you are in a humid climate, but this will pull moisture out. It may take a couple weeks to get 1 to 2% moisture out of those buckets. I find it helps to, every couple of days, mix up those buckets a little bit, but that will pull the moisture out over time. The other thing you can do is if you have a room with a window unit in it, and you can really cool the room, because air conditioners take out a lot of moisture out of a room as well. So if you've got a room with a window unit and you can just crank that AC down to the mid 60s and leave those lids off the bucket, that really pulls the moisture out as well. What I like to do is the picture on the left here, you can get those bucket strainers. So it's a bucket filter that I like to put in that bucket, and it kind of acts as a lid. That way bugs and stuff aren't getting into that honey, since it's got to be left open for a few weeks to get that moisture out of it. But that strainer still releases the moisture out of that honey. So it's like a lid basically, but it's letting the moisture out. So air conditioning works good, but you've got to really crank it down, or put it in a nice chest, seal it up with a dehumidifier for a few weeks. That works as well. Heat works too. So if you can put it in a sealed container and get it up to about 100 to 110 degrees for a few weeks, that also pulls moisture out of buckets of honey. So those are some options if you do have high moisture honey to get that moisture down a bit. By way of reminder, make sure your hives are at least 2 boxes to keep them cooler. And then you can return honey supers to the hive after you've harvested for the bees to clean. There's nothing wrong with leaving a honey super on the bees throughout the summer to give them some extra space. I often will have 2 deep boxes for my brood nests, and then I'll harvest honey out of that, maybe my 3rd super, and then I'll put it back on the hive and let the bees clean it up. And I often will leave it on over the summer to give more dead air space so they stay cooler. Or you can just leave it on for 24 hours till the bees clean it up, then pull it off and store it in wax moth crystals or sertan or however you're going to protect your comb. One little tip though for you is that when you are putting wet supers, so supers that have had honey harvested out of them, back on a hive, put them back on right at sunset. If you put them on in the middle of the day, those supers smell so strongly of honey that you're really going to encourage robber bees to rob that honey. So put them on in the evening so the bees can clean it up and get rid of some of that smell before everybody wakes up and gets robby. Not going to talk a lot about Varroa mites because I talked a lot about that in July. So if you need a refresher on how to handle Varroa mites, go back and watch our July monthly buzz. But July and August, key times to get your Varroa mite levels under control. You might be seeing some bald brood in your hive, and this is where you've got the capped pupa that are uncapped. Pupa aren't supposed to be uncapped. They're supposed to remain capped. And so if you see that, it could mean a couple different things. If it's in a straight linear pattern, it could be, and there's a raised lip around the cell. So you kind of see that in this picture. You kind of have this line and it's a lip left around that cell. It's often caused by wax moths tunneling underneath the comb. It's usually only found in really small, weak hives that are 6 frames of bees or less that can't defend themselves against wax moths. Way more common. It's very rare that I see bald brood due to wax moths. 90% of the time, it's because of Varroa mites. So the bees are practicing what's called hygienic behavior, where they can tell that the pupa is dead or is infected with Varroa mites. The bees are uncapping those cells, pulling the pupa out, throwing it down outside the hive. Now, it's a positive trait. It's good that the bees are doing that, but it's usually an indicator you've got a pretty severe Varroa mite problem. So don't wait until you see visual signs of Varroa mites, like them tearing open cells, like seeing them on bees, to alert you that you've got a problem. You need to be doing a test and treating long before there are any visual signs of Varroa mites. And of course, this is the Varroa mite threat trend. You can see in July, August, you're really peaking as far as the threat. And so if you don't get it under control this time of year, then you're going to be in pretty big trouble. And of course, if you need a reminder, you can follow these QR codes to learn how to test for mites. This one on the left is sticky boards, how to test using sticky boards. And the one on the right is how to test using an alcohol wash. And then if you do decide to treat, you can follow these videos to treat with Apivar and then how to treat with Apiguard. So 2 different pretty good mite treatments and how to test for those. So overview, and I'm not going to spend much time on this at all because Marcus is going to dive in way deeper, but these are kind of the basics of summer care. You want to maintain 30 to 40 pounds of surplus honey. You can feed 1/4 to 1/2 gallon of syrup per hive per week until you've got 30 to 40 pounds. Only feed 1-to-1 sugar syrup this time of year because you want the bees using it. Once we get closer to fall, we'll switch to 2-to-1. Test for mites. You can feed up to 2 pollen patties per month if you really want to go above and beyond for your bees. That's way more important if you're in a dearth. It's going to be more important to feed pollen patties as we get kind of in that final 6 weeks before winter, even if you're not in a dearth. Right now, if you're in a dearth period, you do want to feed pollen patties, but as you get within that 6-week window of 6 to 8 week window, really, I would say, of daytime temperatures being consistently in the 50s, you're definitely going to want to feed pollen patties. I'm going to leave it to Marcus to explain why that's important. Cooling hives, I talked about this a little bit last webinar, but you know, here is some temperature sensors I put inside hives. These were single-story hives. Interesting illustration of what I was talking about in the video. The one on the left, this was a single-story hive, but it was strong. It was a single-story hive, but it was full of bees. It was still 100 degrees inside that hive, so a little hotter than bees like to be. The picture on the right was a very weak single-story hive in the full sun, and they were 105 degrees. They were overheating as a single-story hive. So keeping 2 boxes on your bees is really the easiest and best way to keep them cool in the summer. And of course, water sources. Like I talked about in the video, if you don't have that water source within half to 1 mile, make sure that you're providing a water source for your bees. When to work bees in the summer, I like to work them early in the morning or late in the evening, and that's for your sake and the bee's sake. You know, if you're in an area where it's 100 degrees and you leave a frame of comb out more than a minute, it can really start melting that comb. I also don't gauge the strength of my hive when I'm trying to get a gauge for the adult bee population in the heat of the day, because oftentimes you have a lot of the forager bees out, or maybe they're hanging out underneath the hive to keep the hive cooler. So it's hard to get a good feel for your bee population unless you're checking them early in the morning or late in the day. And then I try to keep inspections in the 5 to 10 minute range per hive or less, because you want to put that hive back together and let the bees circulate that air through the hive, which is hard for them to do when it's all pulled apart. And so I would expect to see increased bearding, like you see in the picture here, and reduced flight. So as you get into the dog days of summer, that's usually what you see. There's more bearding going on, and there is less flight because it's just hot and there's not much for the bees to go out and forage. Totally normal. It's okay to see that. Usually if I see bearding to the extent that is in this picture, I'll often just go add even an empty box on top of the hive to give them a little more space to keep them a little cooler. I'm going to skip that really quickly. I'm going to end on this slide so we can get to Marcus. But if you do have a weak hive, this is the kind of the final month or two to focus on getting it stronger, because winter's actually coming. And so here's what I do if I have a hive that's less than a deep box full of bees, I'm going to usually add a frame of brood, usually capped brood from a much stronger hive into that weaker hive. You can add bees. You can get a frame of nurse bees and shake it off in the entrance of that weaker hive, and they'll go into that hive. Make sure Varroa are completely under control. I'm going to feed them, 1/4 to 1/2 a gallon of 1-to-1 syrup per week. I'm going to feed them pollen substitute, 1/2 pound at a time, so that small hive beetles don't get a foothold. You want to make sure that they can eat the pollen substitute you put in the hive in about 7 days. And then I'm probably going to put some probiotic or essential oils, something like Complete or Bee Cleanse in there as well, just for an added boost. And of course, make sure that the queen is a healthy, vibrant queen. So if the brood pattern is awful throughout the whole hive, you may want to consider requeening as well. But those are the steps I'm going to be taking if I have a hive this time of year that's really weak. So with that, I am thrilled to introduce you guys to Marcus. Marcus has been with us for a minute now in our company, and he, like I mentioned earlier, manages all of our beekeeping companies. He's over all our beekeeping businesses that are directly managing and caring for live bees. So our bulk bee company, our pollination company, etc. And he has quite a fascinating background in the beekeeping world. He's done everything there is to do, pretty much in beekeeping. So, Marcus, if you want to just give us a quick overview of all your history in beekeeping, and I'll turn it over to you. And thanks for joining us tonight.
Oh,
We really
my pleasure.
appreciate your time. Yeah,
My
so
pleasure.
take it away, Marcus.
Thanks, Blake, and thanks for the Bee Supply for your invitation, and thanks for everybody for joining us this evening. I started out beekeeping about 20 years ago on the island of Hawaii, knowing nothing about it, and going to raising hundreds of thousands of queens a year for quite a few years, and then had my own operation for a while. That dovetailed with doing research in queen quality at North Carolina State University, which led to a position doing ecotox for regulatory purposes, plant protection products. And then I wanted to get back into commercial beekeeping because I once had hair and then became a research scientist. I'm partially kidding. But anyway, I have a lot to share with you, so I'm going to jump right into it if I can share my screen somehow. Which one? That's the one. Put this in proper mode. And basically, I'm going to talk to you guys about bees, their biology and physiology, the caste systems, nutrition, and readiness for winter, which really starts now. So we'll start out with honey and wax. Just a few brief things I won't delve too deeply in, but as Blake was saying, there can be a lot of moisture in honey. Honey is nectar less than 18.6% moisture. Basically, in the industry, they're looking at it for about 16.5. Newly built combs consist of recycled comb, brood cappings. New wax is created when all the comb is full and the bees are satiated. And it doesn't matter how full the cell is when there's a nectar flow, but there's no construction when nectar is lacking. I'll move on to pollen, bee bread, and brood food, as pollen is the protein source for bees, and recovery from a protein dearth can take up to 12 weeks and can create a real downward spiral. Foraging for pollen is regulated by colony demand, and those cues are physical inspection, because the pollen foragers, which coincidentally on hot days switch to water foraging, they actually physically inspect each cell and deposit the pollen themselves, as opposed to the nectar foragers, which have middle-aged bees that receive the nectar when they come back. So it's also influenced by pheromones and maybe by trophylactic contact, mouth to mouth, so to speak. So there are 10 amino acids essential for bee growth, with 3 main ones: leucine, isoleucine, and valine, but they're all vital. Only about 77% of pollen is actually digestible. I just found that interesting. And pollen, for a long time in the market, pollen substitutes were primarily focused on protein alone. The problem with that is natural pollen has phytonutrients like omega-3s and omega-6s, which are vital, and trace minerals. So you really want to try to find a pollen substitute that has actual real pollen in it too. In terms of pollen consumption, pollen and bee bread account for about 5% of all protein feedings to brood. Nurse bees consume more pollen. They like fresh pollen, aged 24 to 72 hours. Anything really older than that, they don't really want to eat. But they are the ones that consume the majority of the pollen and convert it to royal jelly, which is fed exclusively to developing queens. And it is the absence of pollen in that fertilized egg turning into a larvae onto a pupae. The absence of pollen in a queen's diet allows her to achieve full reproductive capacity. That's why the cells in the hive are shaped like an umbrella, because you have all these pollen foragers walking across the frame. Pollen's going to drop off their corbicula, but it can't get into the queen cells if it's shaped that way. So queens dictate your colony's phenotype. They lay about 1,500 eggs per day. Intracolonial genetic diversity impacts colony survival. What does that mean? It means that if you have a lot of drones that have mated with that queen, you have a lot more tools in your Swiss Army knife. Your queen, your colony are far more prepared to survive and proliferate, swarm, ultimately, or be splittable. The quality of the queen is very important as well. Supersedure can be a major cause of winter mortality too, and the age of the larvae. When the bees are making their own queen, they'll often take an egg and put it in the cells. When you're grafting, you're trying to find the smallest larvae possible that has the least amount of potential for pollen to have fallen in there. On the continental US, there's about an average of 12 drones that the queens have mated with. So it's important as a queen producer that you saturate your area where you're going to have your mating yards and the vicinity around with plenty of drones. On the islands of Hawaii, for example, the average is 40 drones. So there's a little more tools in your Swiss Army knife. So just to jump into drones a little bit, they're haploid. They have one set of chromosomes from their mother. Their main role is one-time mating. They have a less than 1 in 1,000 chance. So not the easiest life for these guys, but they make multiple trips to the congregation yards, and they take about 30 minutes per flight to do so. They're best at 10 to 21 days old. If they're under 10 days old, they're too immature, and if they're over 21, their semen is too viscous. We're going to jump a little bit into queen glands. So the Dufour's gland, which is absent in drones, is partially responsible for queen retinue response. The mandibular glands are queen mandibular pheromone. They have 5 main components I won't get into right now, but they attract drones in mating flights. That pheromone is what lets your colony know it's queen right. It also contributes to retinue response. It's attracting to young bees, and as the bees age, it becomes less attractive. And it also moderates juvenile hormone in young bees. Juvenile hormone is what makes young bees turn old. Queen retinue pheromone aids in retinue response and inhibits worker ovary development. It's a blend of a bunch of different pheromones that's not produced in the mandibular glands. So just a brief overview of that, all of which contribute to your queen quality, as queen failure is a leading cause of winter mortality. Queen events like supersedure increase that risk of mortality, as I mentioned, possibly due to lower quality queens, those reared from older larvae. Queen promiscuity lowers disease intensity, as in what's used to be called, and still is erroneously, Nosema ceranae, but it's actually Viromorpha. But I don't think anybody's going to change their product labels at this point, but just for sake of clarity, that's what that means. So queen promiscuity also heightens colony strength, decreases the likelihood of diploid drones, which is a phenomenon I'll get into briefly here in a minute, and it beneficially impacts queen physiology as well as their pheromone profiles and retinue response. So the more genetically diverse your colony is, which is fostered by queen promiscuity, the greater chance your bees have to make it through the winter, although that diversity doesn't seem to predict thermoregulatory behavior. So continuing on with the queens, her age, chronological, as well as reared from young or older larvae is important. If you have an old queen, her sperm viability is decreased over time. Queens reared from young larvae are larger and have more stored sperm, mate with more drones, and have more productive offspring. Those headed by young queens have lower winter mortality risk. It was found in a study done, I think it was around 2012, that commercially available queens had an average of about 83.7 plus or minus about 13% sperm viability, but some as low as 20.5. So it's important to get quality queens And the average stored sperm in a queen is about 4.5 million. And the average mating number is about 17, but in the continental US, it was found to be a little closer to 12. So there are many factors that affect brood survival. Pollen dearth, poor nutrition, larvae and pupae can lead to early capping of the pupae, early foraging, and early mortality. So you basically just sped up their lifespan during a pollen dearth, anybody that is continuing to develop. And it's a delayed feedback loop. So the colony age and task structure between your nurse bees, your middle-aged bees, and your forager bees is pushed up a few ticks, and nurse bees become middle-aged more quickly, and middle-aged become older forager bees more quickly. And that just creates inadequate nutrition and less attention to developing brood that came after those more quickly advancing in age bees due to a poor nutrition or pollen dearth. Protein allocation is to older larvae, what's already been invested in at the expense of younger larvae, and they'll actually cannibalize younger larvae to get more protein to feed to the older. Dearths can be caused by lack of available foraging or a lack of foragers or an inability to forage, like in rain. So cannibalism, simply moving and repositioning a frame can lead to this. So it is important to try to put frames back the way that you found them. Nurse bees don't like to go to pollen that's any further than 7 centimeters away. So resource dearth cannibalism is coupled with neglect of young larvae. Eggs and middle-aged larvae are the most likely cannibalized. And there's, as I mentioned, the diploid drones. Diploid cannibalism results from homozygosity at the sex allele, which yields diploid drones. Bees are haploid diploid, drones are haploid. Upon occasion, there are diploid, but the bees just eat those within 6 hours of them hatching. So queen right colonies under normal conditions 48 years ago were found to have brood mortality between 20 and 25% in the spring, 10 to 20% in the summer, and up to half in the autumn. So it is important to make sure they have the protein and phytonutrients that they need. A high proportion of that was cannibalized, which indicates that the bees just didn't have the protein they needed. So where is most of that protein going that goes to nurse bees? Into the hypopharyngeal gland for them to produce royal jelly. The hypopharyngeal gland is most active in young bees, those that are in contact with the open brood. They are functionally flexible, meaning that a middle-aged bee that has a higher vitellogenin level can actually regrow, so to speak, its hypopharyngeal gland. Even foragers, when those vitellogenin levels are way up, it can reduce the atrophy and help regrowth. So it's kind of a fountain of youth for them. The juvenile hormone level increase creates the gland shrinking and helps the bees develop the ability to hydrolyze sucrose. The shrinking of the gland and developmental inhibition of that gland is evident with protease inhibitors, which are part of plant protection products. But interestingly enough, also just a Varroa mite infestation of just 1 to 3 mites has shown to have the same effect as protease inhibitors and inhibits the development of the hypopharyngeal gland. So knowing your Varroa mite levels now and controlling Varroa and ensuring you have an adequate number of well-nourished nurse bees in the time preceding diutinous bee production. Diutinous bees are winter bees. We'll get a little bit into nurse bees. Welcome to the world, and I get to work. That's pretty much how it is. They're developmentally immature when they emerge. They spend the first days cleaning cells, grooming and resting. And the jelly that they need, that royal jelly, when they emerge also for their developmental immaturities and physiological evolutions to occur. They sleep in proximity to the brood nest and in cells. You'll sometimes see them buried in the cell, cozied all up, dreaming peacefully. So, and they don't differentiate between day and night very much. About 4 to 12 days old, they begin feeding royal jelly to the young, to the workers, and to the queen. They serve as the queen retinue and regulate her egg laying by the feeding rate. And they also act as a vehicle for her queen mandibular pheromone, so the colony knows that they're queen right. They help to regulate pollen foragers. When they feed those pollen foragers the royal jelly, the pollen foragers know, hey, we need a lot more pollen, or we can lay off a little bit. And they also feed adult bees, not necessarily foragers, about 1 time per hour. They have a lot on their plate and handle about 2 to 3 larvae during their nursing life, feeding that developing larvae the royal jelly they need. So as more nurse bees emerge, older nurses are pushed out, and that limits their exposure to the brood pheromone and to the queen mandibular pheromone. The decrease of those over time lowers their vitellogenin level and increases their juvenile hormone level, so they age. Just a couple quick interesting tidbits. Pollen digestion takes from a few hours to a full day, though about half of it through radioactive tracers was found to be in the hypopharyngeal gland after about 6 hours. Most of the pollen is eaten within 3 to 4 centimeters with no response over 7 centimeters. So they got a lot on their plate, the nurse bees, but they like to keep close to the cells they need to tend to. And as they become middle-aged, which is about 12 to 21 days of age after emergence, their vitellogenin levels are still up in comparison to foragers. Their main tasks are nest building and maintenance, cementing bees, guard bees, fanning bees in the heat, water carriers. So when the pollen foragers return, they'll carry the water around, pool it around, and other middle-aged bees will fan and create their air conditioning inside. So their juvenile hormone levels are rising, their vitellogenin is falling, and they'll also serve as nectar receivers for nectar foragers and allocate it to different cells. Nectar receiving and building are not typically performed by the same middle-aged bee, meaning nest building. And about 1%, I wanted to put a picture in of the undertaker, about 1% serve as undertakers dragging out the dead. Their recruitment to forager bees comes along as the frequency with which the reception of nectar lengthens and contact increases with the nectar forager seeking relief. So when that span of time gets too long, they're like, hey, we got to jump in and start getting nectar for ourselves, bring it back to the colony. And they sleep as well, though foragers sleep a lot less, middle-aged bees still sleep, and they start to differentiate between day and night. Foragers fly a lot, about 21.5 kilometers per day. It takes about 6 milligrams of sugar per day for flight alone, and they're fed about 2.25 times per hour. A primer pheromone that helps delay the onset of foraging, ethyl oleate, is just another contributor to the overall pheromone profile that is really kind of the computer system that keeps the colony's algorithms running in the right direction, so to speak. And foragers don't sleep much, about 13 to 17% of the time during the day, and maybe close to half of the night. There's little to no sleep and foraging is available, and they're not the ones tucked cozy up in a cell. Workers feed their vitellogenin back to the colony before they start foraging. Their hypopharyngeal glands atrophy, but as I mentioned, they can return to function if those vitellogenin levels are brought back up. Their lifespan is shortened considerably once they begin foraging, and typically 5 to 6 weeks left, and if it's a strong nectar flow, a lot less than that. This is really the time of year to know, hey, how much is my mite load? And start killing them now. 10 to 12% infestation rate in the autumn is the economic threshold, but proactive treatment should be employed to keep the mites below the threshold and undermine the viral infection rates and comorbidity. I always try to keep a rule of thumb about 2 mites per 100 bees. If it's over that, I try to treat. And at this time, I treat anyway, because I want to guarantee that my winter bees as those eggs begin to be laid in the very near future, that they have plenty of nurse bees that have emerged that can feed them, that haven't had their hypopharyngeal glands atrophied by a pollen dearth or lack of nutrition. Also wanted to bring up propolis, which is the antimicrobial envelope. I know it's can be a bit tedious to work through in a hive, but it's vital. It serves as the external immune defense system, and though the source is very efficacy, it does inhibit microbial growth, including like chalk brood, American foul brood. It's also been shown to inhibit Varroa population growth, as well as to contribute to wax moth larvae mortality and to reduce the metabolic rate in wax moth. Now, about a 60-gram resin positively affects colony level immunity. So if you see propolis in your hives, which I hope you do, don't scrape it out and throw it on the ground. Leave it for them. It also helps regulate the airflow, seals the cracks, waterproofing, moisture control, and serves as the adhesion points for when they are drawing out the comb. So tremble dancing by resin foragers stimulates cementing bees, which are forager aged with atrophied wax glands and middle-aged bees, and they remove the propolis from the resin foragers and smooth it for use with their mandibles. And it can take hours and hours to do that. I'm sure you're all well aware if you've tried to rub the propolis off your fingertips after working a hive. But jumping into diatomaceous bees, your winter bees, which are low in juvenile hormone, high in vitellogenin. They're very immunocompetent, and they have an active fat body. And we now know that that fat body is primarily what Varroa mite feeds on. So controlling the Varroa now to ensure that that fat body is intact is very important. Diatomaceous bees are very long-lived, and they focus on thermoregulation. They're your winter cluster. And they also care for the brood that the queen begins to lay in January, and contribute to nursing all of that brood. And then some, even at 280 days old, are your foragers. The young diatomaceous bees are essential going into the winter. I know I've mentioned the word vitellogenin a lot. It is one of my favorites. It's a glycolipoprotein. It's biosynthesized in the fat bodies, and it is essential to the physiological plasticity of the hypopharyngeal gland, to the immune function and disease resistance of the bees, and to suppressing that hormone, juvenile hormone, which causes bees to age. Starvation and freezing is a leading cause of winter mortality. So make sure that, as Blake had mentioned earlier, that if your bees need feed, your syrup, you're giving it to them, and that they have plenty of honey or food, other food stores, sugar bricks going into winter. They need ample resources for a strong population. The winter survival of any colony requires a viable quality queen producing a healthy, sizable population of diatomaceous bees and the resources to support that undertaking, as well as proactive mite, disease, and pest control well before the end of brood production in your region or area, and timed to best enable the achievement of that goal. So that being said, we're checking our mite levels, we're treating for mites, and we're making sure that there's not a dearth of nutrition for the developing generations now who will be feeding those winter bees that are quickly coming up, because timing is everything. This is a fairly old graph from The Wisdom of the Hive by Thomas Seeley, just showing differences in weights and when swarms leave and population drops. And I wanted to include it just to indicate that those events like swarms, which hopefully have pretty much petered out at this point for you all, provide a great change in the weight of the hive. What we're working towards now is ensuring the health of the hive and its weight going into winter. And this is a special thanks to Randy Oliver, who granted me permission to use this graph. It shows the age structure of the bees in Manitoba, Canada, at the different turnover events, diatonis to spring bees, or spring bees to diatonis, or forager summer bees, say, to diatonis bees. And I won't delve too deeply into it, but just wanted to bring it to your attention, because it's pretty amazing when you think about it, that a bee that is emerging at in May can be dead within 6 weeks in a nectar flow, roughly. And a bee that's emerging in November really could still be around in May. So anyway, these are the references that I've used in compiling this. And myself, I'm perfectly happy if you guys reach out to the Bee Supply and want more information on anything that I've shared. I'd be glad to share it with you all. And I thank you all for your kind attention.
Wow, Marcus, thank you so much. That was awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I learned a lot from that. That was fantastic. Let's see if we have a few minutes. So if any of you folks have questions, then I think, let's see. Marcus, actually, if you want to just click on the Q&A box, you should have access to that. And you've got a lot of questions in there. So if you want to read off the question and answer them, then go for it. We've got about 10 minutes, so it's all yours.
Okay, so the first one from Anonymous is, what is your take on Hawaii queens in Texas? Do they typically have a slower start in spring here in Texas? No. You want a young, healthy queen with plenty of opportunity to be amply mated. So, I mean, bees aren't indigenous to the United States. They're all brought in. So I think if I understand the question correctly, if I would not anticipate a queen bee from Texas versus a queen bee from Hawaii having much of a different start if the hive or the nuke is set up right. And that's funny. Have I written a bee book yet? I've been asked that question quite a lot. And the answer is no. But there are a lot of bee books on the market, and I have a lot of competition that's probably far better at it than I am. So, and my mite treatment of choice going into winter, it actually varies. For myself, I tried to use, with great success over the years, formic acid, Apivar, and oxalic acid in a rotation pertinent to the label. Always follow your labels. I like oxalic vaporizers too, which are fine, though I don't want to do it too often because you can cripple the queen's legs that way. But formic acid and Apivar also can be very temperamental for a hive. So you want to be careful using those as well, which is why I say follow the labels, and really say if you're using formic acid, you want it to be daytime temperatures of about 78 or less, which you're not going to get in Texas. Apivar is a much more usable product in extreme temperatures, but the label, if I remember, says put 50 grams on and then 2 weeks later put another 50 grams on. I'd advise doing 30, waiting about 7 to 9 days, doing another 30, and then doing another 30. Do it in 3 stages. It's not as hard on the hive itself, and it has great efficacy in my experience. And I would clue you guys into also vegetable glycerin and oxalic acid. I don't remember the recipe off the top of my head, but I can provide it, and just on sheets on the top of the brood box, top of your bottom brood box, helps to keep the mite levels suppressed. So I've had good experience with that too. And no, I've not used the CO2 method in mite testing. So soup procedure is a primary. So there's a question that I mentioned queen death was primary reason for colonies not making it through winter, and then later starving and freezing. So not that she necessarily died from starving and freezing, but if she was an older queen or didn't have enough semen and it was superseded, that queen that's the product of the supersedure probably isn't the best queen either. So usually a supersedure event in the summertime is a good indicator that, hey, you know what? They had to replace the queen because the one that was in the hive, they didn't like her. They created another one. And it's fairly doubtful that it was optimally produced. So it might be a good idea to requeen. Hopefully I've answered that question for you. How do I feel about adding banana peel to the nutrition toolbox? You got me there, Nora Rachels. I'm not familiar with the banana peel. But I'd love to learn more about it. James asks, what has been my experience with the effect of continuous high temperatures on the queen's health? It fries sperm. Let's see. I don't want to misremember, but I'm thinking around 110 or even a little lower, you're going to be frying sperm inside of a few hours. Sure, I can, from Patty Hendrick, saying she would appreciate the recipe. It's actually Randy Oliver's recipe but I'd be glad to share it. Anonymous also asks, have I ever used honey in frames? Whoops, jumping around on me, to draw wax if no nectar or sugar water is there? Well, if there's no nectar coming in and you've got enough honey in your frames to stimulate them to start drawing out frames of foundation, if I'm understanding this correctly, it can help stimulate it. But if they're not going to be refilling what's being drawn out very quickly, that stimulation is going to stop pretty quick. Hopefully that makes sense. But doing a YouTube, Jim asked, how about doing a YouTube on this and my suggestions, but I'm not sure what this is. And yes, Nora, I'd appreciate very much learning more about the banana peel. If I'm missing anybody's questions, I'm sorry. The screen jumps and I feel like I've missed some. And let's see, what refractometer do I recommend to measure moisture in honey? I honestly just buy the cheapest one I can find off Amazon. And sometimes they come with the bricks, which is basically you just subtract that number from 100 as opposed to it telling you what the moisture content is. So, and it looks like that's all they're popping up.
That looks like there'll probably be a couple more pop up, and we can answer those if they come up. But Marcus, thank you. I mean, everyone loved it. Tons of positive comments. Everybody says, we should do you should have a permanent segment in the webinar to talk about some of this. So
I'd be glad to.
That'll be fun. That'd be fun. But yeah, thank you so much. That was just phenomenal. And if any of you are looking for specific information from Marcus, then just shoot an email to us at the Bee Supply, and then just put for Marcus, and then that'll get forwarded on to Marcus if you guys have questions. The one thing I did want to touch on, Marcus, so the banana thing that's become, I don't know if it's nationwide, but a lot of people in Texas have been feeding whole bananas, peel and all. There's some theories that it helps with chalk brood. And so and then it also seems to supply some interesting nutritional profiles for that might be lacking in normal pollens for bees. And so a lot of beekeepers are just slicing them in half, putting it on. The bees eat them really quickly.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah, so there's been a few interesting papers on that. So I know, I thought it was just crazy and like putting mashed potatoes in your hive or something. But then I had one yard a couple springs ago that the entire yard had chalk brood really bad. And so we went to Costco and got these huge, we had like 200 hives in this yard, and we got these huge boxes of bananas. And half the yard got 2 bananas sliced up in every single hive. The other half of the yard got nothing. Came back about, I don't know, it was 10 to 12 days later, and the half that got bananas were almost completely chalk brood free, and the half
Wow.
that didn't get bananas still had some chalk brood. And so that's not exactly a scientific study, but it was interesting. It was interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
So,
that's a study for sure. So,
yeah, yeah.
that is interesting. But yeah, that gives me another rabbit hole to dive down.
Yeah, yeah. I think you have a few more questions, and then once we get those answered, then we'll go ahead and wrap it up for the evening.
Is there any work being done to develop a bait for Varroa mites to attract them, I guess, rather than kill them? I don't know, honestly. I know. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I know that as they, I think it'd be very difficult to attract them specifically to that as opposed to the brood itself, because they're so just, I mean, I guess theoretically you could with the right pheromone profiles, but they're very attached to the brood in their cycle. But maybe patent pending.
Yeah, that would be a kind of a holy grail if you could just attract them out of the hive. That'd be
Yes,
amazing.
for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. And Diane said in the comments that Stan shared the recipe or the banana nutrition purposes and profiles a few years ago, and we'll try to track that down, and I'll try to mention it in next month's webinar. So, well, Marcus, thank you again. It was a pleasure
My
having you.
pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Fascinating presentation, and probably will not be the last, I hope. So
Well,
it's great to see you.
my pleasure. Thanks, Blake, and thanks to Bee Supply, and thank you everyone for your attention and for your
Awesome,
questions.
awesome. Yes, great questions, guys. Well, thank you, everybody. And with that, we will go ahead and wrap it up. And we cannot wait to see you in September, where it starts getting cool in some parts of the country. And we start really focusing in on getting our bees ready for winter, setting everything up properly for the coming bee season. So with that, we'll see you all in about a month. Have a great evening, everybody.